Matthew Dix is one of the most accomplished storytellers of all time, and he wrote a book which documents how you can emulate his ability to tell a story. Despite what you instinctually might think, it's actually not something that you're inherently born with or without. Anybody can learn to tell a good story. And so in this podcast, you're going to hear about the following: the beautiful consequences of becoming a better storyteller, how the work that Matthew suggests can make you a better family man and a better father and a better friend. Matthew will read an original story that he has told hundreds of times now. He's going to reveal the key ingredients to good storytelling, something actionable that you can go and take away in your next interaction. He talks a lot about the idea of narrative as well, and uses the analogous story to explain why Jurassic Park actually isn't about dinosaurs. And then we finish with the story of my own that I actually put together as soon as I finished Matthew's book, being so inspired by these lessons that he had imparted on us. And so I hope you enjoy it. And if you do enjoy it, please be so kind as to pump your good juice into the algorithm and leave a review. Let the algorithm know that this is something you enjoyed. So Matthew Dix is the author of Storyworthy and 50-time Moth Storyslam champion and 6-time Grand Champion. Now, what does that mean? What is the Moth Storyslam? And this is a touch of a trite comparison, but it's kind of the Liga BBVA equivalent of storytelling in the USA. And this is less trite and more accurate. Matthew Dix is the Lionel Messi of storytelling. So he is arguably the best storyteller in the world, which is just a remarkable thing to have against your name. He wears many hats, all of them in education. He's a teacher, an author, a performer, and a writer. And his book Storyworthy had both an emotional effect on me, but more importantly, was a huge inspiration and a significant motivator for me to create a podcast or a YouTube video or to write online. As you've seen on the website, there's hundreds of articles there. Most of them just existed on Word documents in my computer. But although Matthew doesn't explicitly make this sort of argument, there was just something about the homework for life and the ability to tell better stories that encouraged me to just release what I was doing into the public. And so you've heard what you can expect from the chat. I really hope you enjoy it. I'm not going to ramble on anymore. And so leave that spicy review. And here is Matthew Dix. Well, Mr. Dix, Matthew, welcome. How are you, mate?
I'm very good. Thanks. Nice to see you.
Cheers, mate. Really pleasure for you to join me this morning. It's 6 a.m. over where you are. Where are you actually?
Connecticut.
Okay, there you go. So
it's on
what's that?
The eastern side of the United States.
Okay, nice. And then it's a nice, lunchtime for me here in Stockholm. But you wrote a book called Storyworthy. You also have done lots of other work, but at least how I was introduced to you and your brain and your ideas was through this wonderful book, Storyworthy, which is what I want to obviously speak about with you today. But something caught me off guard as I was reading about your biography first. Like, are you somehow connected to the English monarchy? You're the Lord of Sealand. And the more I looked into this, I was just like, what is going on here? So do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. It's something that annoys my wife, actually. So Sealand is a military platform off the coast of England. They were built during World War II to, protect from the Luftwaffe when they were attacking. And the oddity about these military platforms is they were both abandoned after the war, but they're outside the international zone of, where you get to own the ocean. So they're sort of in international waters. And so 60 years ago, a guy landed on one of these platforms and declared it his own and declared it his own country. And at one point, the British actually attempted to expel him from the platform and couldn't manage to do it. So he declared his own country. So he sort of decided that the way to make money in order to stay on this platform was he would sell lordships and ladyships and baronies and things like that to this country, which really hasn't been recognized by any other country. And I saw this on the internet and said, wow, that sounds great. I could become the Lord of Sealand, which is, in this man's mind at least, a country and, some sort of entity that exists in international waters. So I spent the $50 to get the plaque and all of this, which my wife found out about and said, why are you wasting $50 on nonsense?
Come on, it's not a
And I
waste.
said, it's not a waste. I said, you know how many times like I'll be at a show or on a podcast and someone will ask me about it and I get to tell this funny story about this guy on a platform.
Hmm.
Plus, it's one of the best gifts you can ever give a guy, I think.
Yeah.
Like when someone says like I need a Father's Day idea, I say give them the Lord of Sealand. Like it's so nice to just walk around knowing you're the Lord of something.
Are you ever
So
introduced as Lord Dix?
no, I have not been introduced as Lord Dix. That's perhaps an aspirational goal that I will have now.
Yeah, certainly. Or if they were to be so cheeky and put like a third word in between the two of them.
Yeah, well, it is a it's a challenging last name.
Oh, it's a terrific last name, mate.
Yes, it is
Yeah.
now. When I was like 12, it was challenging.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I'm called Hog, which in Australia doesn't mean anything. It means pig, right? But no one really gives a shit.
Yeah.
But apparently for my father, when he was in America, when he was a younger man, it was actually a problem for him. People were really awkward about introducing him as Professor Hog.
Yeah.
They tried calling Professor Philip or something like this, which is his first name. But yeah, I guess maybe Americans are a little bit more squeamish about anything that's too close to like a sexual inflection at times. But I guess that is falling away, isn't it?
Well, I'd like to think so, but actually in the UK, I published my novels under Matthew Green because my UK publisher asked me to change my last name because they felt that my current last name, Dix, is too potentially offensive to British sensibilities. So it
I'm
goes the other way,
shocked
at
to
least
hear
in the
that.
UK.
I'm shocked. I thought the
Yeah.
last country in the world that wouldn't embrace dicks would be the United Kingdom. Nassim Taleb has a very famous quote about, well, definitely not very famous, just something that I remember from him when he said it. If you're familiar with him, maybe you are.
Yeah.
In the Better Procrustes, one of his aphorisms is the great thing about England is about being an author in England is that there is nothing so bad you can do that will not destroy your reputation, which is him just sort of, making the comment that the salaciousness of England is accepted. I mean, they're the home of the tabloid, right? And the real gotcha journalism really started there. I'm shocked that they didn't want
Yeah.
Dix. Dix is almost a tick of approval. It's like, here we go. Let's get Dix in like big, bold writing at the top of this book, and it'll at least draw people's attention. I would have thought so, but apparently not.
No, I guess not. It made my wife happy. I took her maiden name as my author name, and that made her
Sure.
happy. So it was an opportunity to please my wife. So that's
True.
always good.
So you're the Lord of Sealand. Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. That's definitely something I'd love to do as well. I did hear, along similar lines, there's like, private estates in Scotland, and people will buy, say, a square meter of it, and then they can officially become the Lord of X, and stuff like that.
I'm going to look into that. That's
Yeah, 'cause you
great.
got the
That's even more.
Scottish recognition as well.
Yeah. Well, that's actually land too, not some military platform in the middle of the ocean. That feels a little more legit.
Matthew, I want to read a quote from the beginning of the book. And this, I think, just does a terrific job at summarizing the importance of storytelling, right? So I teach professors, school teachers, ministers, priests, and rabbis who want to improve their lectures and sermons and hold the attention of their audiences. I teach storytelling to people who want to improve their dating skills. I teach people who want to be more interesting at the dinner table. I teach grandfathers who want their grandchildren to finally listen to them. I teach students who want to tell better stories on their college applications. I teach job applicants who are looking to improve their interview skills. I teach people who want to learn more about themselves. So I say that as the preamble to say, we all know that person who is, the natural storyteller. Very charismatic, they can draw the attention in any room, and you sort of remember what they say. And this isn't because of some predisposition or whatever. Maybe they were in a household that really encouraged these sort of skills and they just implicitly learned it growing up, something like this. But if you're not one of these people, you can definitely be pigeonholed into this corner of like, well, I'm just not a very good storyteller. And that's like a really, that can manifest into further things like maybe I'm not that interesting. Maybe I don't have good stories to tell. Maybe I'm a bit boring. And that is for sure, that afflicts 99% of us because only 1% of the people get to be the natural charismatic storytellers. Anyway, Storyworthy reaffirms that you can, in fact, become a good storyteller. It's not something that's innate or predisposed. Now, yourself have now been, recognized and given the authority as a good storyteller because you've won a lot of storytelling competitions, wrote a book about this subject. However, I wanted to ask, where on the spectrum, naturally, did you fall on the good storyteller? Were you naturally good, or did it come to you?
It's interesting. I used to think I was naturally good. I used to sit in workshops with people and I would say I got lucky at the age of 39 that I started doing something that
Mm.
I was just naturally good at. I took a stage, I won my first competition. I started winning quite a bit right away. And people recognized me right away as, one of those naturally good storytellers. And then one day in a workshop, my wife was in the back of the room and I said this thing that I got lucky that I fell into this thing at 39 and that I'm good at it. And from the back of the room, she said, "Is that what you tell people?" And I said, well, yeah. It's not like I went to
Mm.
school to become a storyteller. And my wife pointed out to me, she said, "Well, first of all, you're an author. You've published novels, and I've been writing every single day without missing a
Mm-hmm.
day since I was 17 years old." She said, "You don't think that all of that time playing with story and writing novels and all the things you've learned about how stories work didn't assist you?" And I said, "Oh, well, that's a good point. Maybe that did help." And then she said, she kept talking. She said, "And what about you being a DJ for the last 20 years? You stand up in front of weddings for 20 years, speak extemporaneously to a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
people that kind of don't want to listen to you. Half of them are drunk, and you've managed to like find a way to engage them with your voice. You don't think that helped the first night you took the stage? Like the fact that you're never frightened in
Mm-hmm.
front of a crowd, you don't think that helps at all?" And I said, "Yeah, that's a good point too." And then she said, "And you've been a teacher for more than 20 years. You stand in front of the worst audience there ever was, which is 10-year-old kids, and you have to engage and entertain at all times. And all you do is
Mm-hmm.
tell them stories throughout the day to keep them learning." She said, "You don't think all of that came, assisted you in what you've been doing?" And I just remember sitting in front of this class going, "I guess I've been learning how
Yeah.
to do this for a long time unintentionally." So it's hard to parse it out because I do know as a kid I was the person who would tell stories. As a younger person, the way I've always managed to like attract the attention of a girl is I stand next to them as long as possible and I tell stories and try to make them laugh. So it was something I was doing early on. I don't know how effective I was compared to today. I suspect it's probably somewhere in the middle, but it's difficult to really say whether I was naturally good at a young age or all of this work that I've been unconsciously doing
Yeah,
led
I
to
love
my
that.
success. So
How
it's
your
hard to
wife is
tell.
just stripping you bare in front of this classroom you're supposed to be the authority in front of. Yeah.
Not the
Um.
first time, nor the last time will she do
So
that.
yeah, that intuitively makes a lot of sense. Even though you weren't intentionally building the skills and repertoire, you were doing loads of iteration, figuring out what people responded to, what they didn't respond to, and I suppose you also had the benefit of being able to say the same thing many times to refine it. And so when you did step up 39 on the Moth
Yeah.
stage, you could absolutely kill it. But you're saying you therefore don't think you were actually a natural storyteller. You instead just happened to be doing all these things which developed the skills to the point where you were a good storyteller.
Yeah, I think the one thing I had going for me very early on is I've always been a naturally vulnerable person. At a young age,
Mm.
with parents who really didn't pay a lot of attention to me, something that I figured out early on was that if I say the things that most people are
Mm.
unwilling to say, I will get a positive response. So I was always the person willing to share
Mm-hmm.
my stupidities, my failures, my embarrassments. I remember when I was a teenager getting excited when I did something stupid, because then I knew when I was around my friends again, I would have a new and entertaining story to tell. So, my friend Andy once told me I live out loud. Essentially, anything that happens to Matt, he will talk about in any way whatsoever. It kind of doesn't matter how terrible it was. And I did that as a really early aged kid. So I think I was naturally vulnerable. I didn't have those barriers that I know so many people have in terms of worrying about what other people are going to think about them. That is both a positive and a negative. My wife often points out too,
Hmm.
like it's legitimate that I kind of don't care what anyone thinks of me, which can
Yeah,
be
for
really
sure.
powerful or really terrible depending on the context that we're in. So that early on was something I understood. Whether I had the skills to put these stories together or not, I'm not quite sure.
I imagine also there was some embarrassing moments where you maybe were too vulnerable and you had to realize that, wait a minute, there is a limit to how much people actually want to hear about my stories or my failures. Some things can get too real. I'm just thinking of when I was also a younger person. I like how you said that you're naturally vulnerable. I think that actually resonates with me quite a lot. Now, I wasn't as much of a storyteller as you were, but I at least would never feel weird about sharing something awkward or dumb that I did or happened. But there was definitely a line where there were some things you didn't necessarily want to say. Did you have these really embarrassing, awkward moments to like iterate to the point where you knew where the line was?
That's interesting. I truly I can't remember one. You know, I was always good as a kid at, using language in a way that sort of buffered those situations. I'm good at euphemisms,
Mm,
so, even if it came to something really awkward, I would often speak of it with a metaphor, with a simile. I would speak around it
nice.
rather
Yeah.
than speaking to it. I know that when I was a kid, very young, I was writing political cartoons. I was writing political cartoons at like 10 or 11. I was doing it Easter one day. I was writing these things about Reaganomics, and the problems with the economy. And sort of, again, no one was really paying attention to me. My parents, nobody, even teachers were not paying attention to me. But my aunt actually noticed me writing these political cartoons, and she scooped them up at the end of Easter. And she sent them to me just a couple of years ago. She said, "I want you to know you were doing this when you were like 10 or 11, but nobody was paying
Mm,
attention." And I kind of remember doing that, but I don't remember it fully. So I suspect I had some facility with language that was very helpful to me. I'm also an auditory
okay.
learner and not a visual learner in any way. So I can spend the whole day with,
Could you explain the
well,
difference?
people learn in a variety of ways. One of the ways is, for me, I can learn through hearing. I remember everything that's said to me. That's why I was great. I was a college debate champion. When you say something to me,
Mm,
I can repeat it right back to you, and I can repeat the bit of it that will sort of ruin your argument. I'm really good at remembering
right,
everything
right.
it said. It makes me very annoying when you have to argue with me. But I'm not a
Sure.
visual learner. So, like, I can spend all day with my wife, turn my back to her, and I can't tell you what she's wearing. And I have a little bit of face
Interesting.
blindness where if I meet someone, I just saw someone on the street the other day, and it's someone I work with. But because she was
Hmm.
out of context with me, when she started speaking to me, I didn't know who she was at first until she had said a few sentences, and her voice, the sound of her voice, triggered who she was to me. So,
Wow, that's quite extreme.
yeah, it is. I know. My wife says you can line up 10 brunettes in a line, including her, and I wouldn't be able to pick her out of the lineup, which is not true, but
Oh,
there's
don't
absolute
admit to
truth
that,
in
mate.
what she's saying. It's just the way I am. I just don't
Uh
remember
huh.
anything I see, but I remember everything I hear. And I think as a kid, that really probably helped me a lot in terms of language, being able to use language. It
Yeah,
didn't
I'm
help me in
sure.
regards to remembering what anything ever looked like. I didn't recognize people, and I couldn't do things like tie knots in Boy Scouts because that was a visual memory task that was really
Right,
challenging to me.
right.
But I think my auditory memory is probably very helpful to me too in that regard.
Mm. So it definitely sounds like you were maybe more of a naturally inclined storyteller, or at least someone feeling well acquainted with language
Yeah,
to be able to use it, turn it around, reshape it.
probably.
Um, and so that is, you might be on the naturally on the spectrum towards a more good storyteller, but there is still hope for those who aren't.
Yes.
Like maybe my mate Tavo, who you know, such a lovely person, but not necessarily a talker. And definitely not someone who wants to share anything about their own life or their own experiences. It has to be ripped out of them
Right.
with force. But there's still hope for even someone like that on the other end of the spectrum, not naturally a storyteller, because they can learn from Storyworthy and iterate themselves how to actually tell a good story. So I wanted to ask, are all the ideas in the book original to you? Like, did you lean, because I don't think there's much literature in this sort of field. Did you invent or put language to these concepts a lot yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I started teaching adults how to tell stories, it wasn't something I wanted to do initially because I teach children all day. But eventually, people asked me often enough that I agreed to do it once, and then I'll never do it again. And now I do it for a living.
Mm.
But what I realized I had to do was I had to look at the things that I was already doing on stage and pull it apart. I had sort of internalized all of the things that are in that book and many things beyond it. I was already doing those things, but I was doing it on an unconscious level.
Mm-hmm.
I understood that the beginnings and ends of stories had to be in opposition to each other. I just inherently understood that, but I had never vocalized it before until I started listening to adults tell me stories so that I could help them with their stories. And it
Mm-hmm.
became clear to me really quickly that people just didn't understand how a story worked. And I understood how it worked, but didn't have any language to
Yeah.
explain it. So that book is really a reflection of 3 years of teaching adult students how to tell stories and finding the ways to make them understand what I was doing. And so one of the things I did right away is I started listening to my own stories, and I started listening to the things that I was doing. And I thought, oh, well, I always have a physical location when I'm telling a story. Why would you not want someone to set the scene? And I
Mm-hmm.
realized, oh, nobody ever really does that. That's not a thing that people seem to understand. And
Mm.
so as I started to dissect my own stories and I started to listen to the problems in other people's stories, I started to figure out, well, this is what I do, and this is sort of how I should present it. A big part of the success of this book has been I've been an elementary school teacher for 23 years, so I understand how curriculum works. I understand how to build a curriculum in small, repeatable parts. I understand how to front load the most important things in the beginning and taper off with the least important things as we move along in the
Mm-hmm.
instruction. So all of that really helped me too, so that when I was listening to people and listening to myself, I was really pulling it apart in the same way I'd pull apart a long division problem to teach my students. I'd look at long division and say, well, I know how to do it, but now I have to teach my kids how to go step by step to do it themselves. I took the same approach to storytelling.
Nice. And there really are some terrific parts of it as well. Something like the backpack, I think about a lot actually when I tell stories, because that's kind of like how you keep someone interested. Make sure they they give a shit all the way to the end, and then obviously the 5 second moment, which is something I really want you to elucidate more on. But before we get to that, there's a big difference between presenting a story on stage and then telling a story to a group of friends. Do you agree with this statement?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when you tell a story to friends, you're going to be interrupted first of all, so you have to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
You're going to get clarifying questions and all of this business. But it's a less formal version of the story that you're telling to friends, but I like to say they're sort of cousins to each other.
Hmm.
I like to think that the stories I tell on stage are very similar to the stories I will tell to my friends. Certainly more formal, certainly more prepared, but it should still sound on stage like I'm talking to you as if we're having dinner almost. It should be a conversational approach to storytelling and not sort of what my wife calls a performancy
Hmm.
approach to storytelling, which she despises. And I also do not like, but not to the degree that she really
Can you give
loathes
an
it.
example of that? Like how it might be obvious when someone is overperforming something, but is there a little bit more to it than that?
Yeah, it's things like when people stand on a stage and they open their story with unattributed dialogue. So they'll open with a sentence. It'll be like they'll stand on stage, they'll take a breath, and then they'll say, John, it's time for dinner, my wife yelled. And that's just weird
Sure.
because, like, in real life, if you said, how was your day, Matt? I wouldn't say, Matt, it's time for dinner, my wife yelled. You'd just never speak to me again. That would be a weird way to open a conversation with just random
Right.
dialogue. And yet people think that's an interesting way to begin. I know why they do. It's because when you get taught how to write in school, you get taught by people who are not writers, but people who imagine what writers
Right.
do. And so I have heard teachers tell kids, oh, start with dialogue. That's really engaging. And I always think, no, it's not. It's weird. Like, it's just not the way people speak. It's not the way you should open something. They love onomatopoeia too. They love to start their stories with boom, the door opened. But again, if we were having breakfast and you said, how was yesterday, Matt? I wouldn't start with boom, the
Yeah.
door opened, you wouldn't have breakfast with
Yeah.
me anymore. Or people they sort of work out their movements. We saw this happening just recently in New York. I was competing against somebody, and on the street I was watching him practice his story, and he was practicing his synchronized hand movements to go along with his story. And I thought, well, I'm going to beat you because you're going to look
Right.
weird. And people who look weird don't win storytelling
Mhm.
competitions, because you can't be vulnerable and authentic if you have already pre-prepared your hand movements. So that's the kind of stuff that makes you very performancy and not very natural. Lots of other things
Mhm.
too, but those things in particular can really kill you as a
Mm.
storyteller.
And I interrupted you as you were explaining the difference between on stage and at a dinner party.
Oh, yeah, so I guess on stage I am trying to hold the audience's attention to a greater degree. When I'm at a party and I'm with my friends and I'm telling a story, the assumption is they're going to listen to me. They're also my friends. So that means they like me and will tolerate me even if my story
Sure,
is
sure.
boring. That is why so many bad storytellers exist in the world.
Because they just have good
Most
friends.
people only tell stories to people who love them, right? So if you're only telling stories to people who like and love you, they will put up with bad storytelling all
Mm.
day long. I tell stories to strangers, hundreds of strangers at a time. They have no reason to want to like me or want to listen to me. So when I'm on stage, I am attempting to speak in such a way that I hold their attention at every second, because I know I can lose it at
Mhm.
any second. Whereas at a party, I'm not so worried about that. So, the idea that I have to keep them wondering at all time at a party does not really exist as much as it
No.
does on the stage. There's more demands from the stage than there is at a party.
So I was hoping we might be able to get a flavor for what we're talking about here. Are you comfortable with telling your stories on podcasts and stuff like this?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So if you'll allow me to preamble and then ask you to tell this is going to suck. However, so um, when you're 12 years old, you're stung by a bee and then found by paramedics, not breathing, no heart beating. When you're 14, you're saved from a burning house from some firefighters. When you're 17, you die in a car accident. When you're 22, jailed for a crime you didn't commit. Same year, gun pressed to your head with the trigger being pulled multiple times in an armed robbery whilst working in McDonald's. That's fucking wild. And then 36, your entire career and reputation threatened with destruction. So these are all moments that we would think, wow, that's fodder for great stories. Like that, that's crazy, Matthew. How did you get through that? But then you make the point with this is going to suck that the massive moments, they might seem obvious fodder for stories, but it's actually the little things that make the best stories, and that's the 5-second moment. So with that preamble, I was hoping you could tell us that this is going to suck
Sure.
story.
I haven't told this one in a while, but it's good. All right. So it's December 23rd, 1988. I'm 17 years old. I'm stepping out of a record store, which is a brick and mortar facility where we once purchased music in a physical form. I've got a shopping bag in my hand, and as I turn right onto the sidewalk, I see my friend Pat walking towards me. Pat sees my shopping bag and he asks me what's inside, and I tell him it's a Christmas present. It's a surprise Christmas present. It's actually a surprise Christmas present for our friend Benji, who is my best friend. Pat looks at me a little weird, and I've learned to pay attention to this look. He's only 14 or 15 years old at the time, but he's already cooler than I will ever be in my entire life. And I have learned that when Pat looks like this to me, I need to pay attention. Pat tells me guys don't buy Christmas presents for other guys. He tells me guys especially don't buy surprise Christmas presents for other guys. He tells me he's had multiple girlfriends at a time for long periods of time, and he's never bought any of them anything. So the fact that I've gone out on this day to buy Benji a surprise Christmas present is weird. I am now feeling very self-conscious about the beta fish in the back seat of my car. The surprise Christmas present I bought for Pat like half an hour ago at the pet store. And now the comic books I bought for Coog, the sweatshirt I bought for Lisa, all of these surprise Christmas presents that I have now filled the back seat of my car with. And I know Pat's right. It is weird that a 17-year-old kid has gone out and bought Christmas presents for his teenage friends. But it's been a long time since I've had a good Christmas. And I've decided that this year is going to be different. I'm a senior in high school, getting ready to graduate, but I'm also a McDonald's manager. I make $5.25 an hour, and I am the richest person in the world who I know. And I've spent the last 2 or 3 months saving all of my money so I could go out on this day and buy the Christmas I have always wanted. A lifetime of childhood poverty and now my parents' failing marriage have made the last few holiday seasons, honestly, times I just wish it never happened to begin with. So this year is going to be different. I am going to have presents and I'm going to have the Christmas I've always dreamed of. I need to get home now. My shopping is finished. I have to get home because the beta fish needs to get out of this cold car and get into the house. But mostly I have to get home because I have a shift at McDonald's in a little while and I need my uniform. I'm running late. I've never shopped in my life. I've never actually had money in my life. So I never understood how long it can take and how awful shopping can be. And so I've got all of the presents piled into my car. It's my mother's car. I'm driving a 1976 Datsun B210. It is a car about the size of a box of Pop Tarts. And I'm driving through the town of Mendon, Massachusetts, heading home. It's this beautiful country town, and it's snowing. It's the first snowfall of the year. The lawns are turning white, and every house is decorated for Christmas with the twinkling lights and the ornaments. And as I drive through this little country town through the snow, it's like driving by picture postcards of Christmas. And as I drive, I start to really believe in my heart that this is going to be the Christmas I've always been looking for. I come up a hill, and as I come down the backside of that hill, my car starts to slide in the snow and ice that's collected on the road. I start sliding into the opposite lane. I look up and I see a white Mercedes Benz coming right at me. In the seconds it takes for our two cars to collide, a bunch of thoughts run through my mind. They say that time will slow down or even stop in these moments, and it's absolutely true. The first thought I have is, I'm not wearing my seatbelt, and I always wear my seatbelt. But in the rush to get home and the excitement over shopping, I've forgotten to put my seatbelt on the worst day of my life to forget. The second thought I have is I've always been told to steer into the skid when this happens. It occurs to me in this moment, I don't know what the fuck that means. I still, to this day, do not know what steer into the skid means. And the third thought that I have, it's just one sentence. I say it out loud. It's 5 words. This is going to suck. And it does. When our cars collide head on, I'm thrown forward and my chin hits the steering wheel. It knocks the entire bottom row of my teeth out in one chunk and sends them to the back of my mouth. But I continue forward and I go through the windshield forehead first. But I don't get fully ejected from the car because my legs surge forward at the same time. My right leg becomes embedded in the air conditioning unit right down to the bone. And my left leg hits the emergency brake release. It knocks off that plastic handle, but the post skewers right through my knee. And then my chest comes forward and it hits the steering wheel. It breaks ribs and knocks all of the air out of my body. It happens in a second. And then shock, like blessed shock, just descend upon me. It takes away all the pain and all the fear. I managed to pull my head out of the windshield and I pull my legs out from the dashboard. I actually get out of the car. I'm sort of standing by the door, half crumpled, holding onto the door for support when I see the woman from the Mercedes Benz running over to me. She's completely unharmed. Her seatbelt and the size of her car have protected her, but she takes one look at me, vomits, and passes out on the side of the road. The next people to arrive just after that, it's a pickup truck full of kids, and the kids are in the back of the pickup, and they're jumping out before the truck even comes to a stop. And the first kid to get to me, he's somebody just about my age. He grabs me by my bloody jean jacket, and he lays me down in the mud and the snow on the side of the road. He looks me over, and then he gets really close to my ear, and he whispers to me. He says, "Dude, you're fucked." It is the most accurate medical assessment I'm going to receive on that day. The next person to arrive is a police officer. When he finds me, he takes his jacket off and he lays it on top of me to keep me warm. He doesn't know my ribs are broken and I can barely breathe. It feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds on my chest. I'm looking up at a white sky and the snow is really starting to fall now, so I close my eyes. When I open my eyes again, I'm in the back of an ambulance as a young woman straddling my waist. She's pounding on my chest, which is on fire now. And there's a man forcing a clear plastic tube down my throat, and I'm coughing, and she's shouting, "He's back, he's back." And I'm wondering who is back and where did he go and where the hell am I and where are we going? And I'll find out later, much, much later, that I'm back. That for about a minute, my heart stopped beating and I stopped breathing, but now I'm back. And so now I'm in the emergency room and there's doctors and nurses all around me trying to keep me alive. There's nurses with tweezers pulling hundreds of pieces of glass out of my forehead. And dental surgeons come in and they grab that chunk of teeth that have been floating around my mouth the whole time. They wire them down into my jaw. It's the most painful thing that's ever happened to me. And then there's doctors working on my knees, prepping me for surgery. But I hear a nurse tell me that it's December 23rd and surgeons are hard to come by. A nurse comes over and she asks me for my name. They don't know who I am. They've cut all of my clothes off at the accident scene. And in the process, they lost my wallet. So nobody knows who I am. So I tell her my name. I give her my phone number. And then I give her the phone number for McDonald's. I tell her she needs to call because I'm supposed to be at work in a little while. She needs to tell them I'm not going to be there. She looks at me like I'm crazy. And I kind of am. Like I was literally dead a little while ago now. And now I'm worried about my shift at McDonald's. But I tell her, Linda Diaz, she's going to need help in the drive-thru. It doesn't run well without me. You need to call McDonald's. We go back and forth a little bit. And finally, she agrees to call. And so I'm lying on a gurney in the middle of an emergency room, surrounded by people who barely know my name. And as they're working on me, I can see their faces begin to shift, especially the nurses. And I know what they're thinking. They're starting to think the same thing that I am thinking. Where the hell is this kid's parents? I've been in this emergency room for a very long time, and I haven't seen anyone who I know. We'll find out later that when that nurse went to call my parents, my stepfather answers the phone. And when he finds out that I'm in stable condition, they decide to go check on the car before they check on me. So I won't see my parents before I'm rolled into surgery that day. So I'm surrounded by human beings, but I feel as alone as I have ever felt in my life. But it turns out I'm not alone because that nurse also called McDonald's like she promised. And the manager on duty, the one who took the call, he told my friends what happened. And an old-fashioned phone tree began with friends calling friends calling friends. And now they're coming to the hospital. They're in that waiting room just outside the emergency room. And I know it because I can hear them because they're teenagers and they're loud. It's a room filled with 15 and 16 and 17-year-old kids in ripped jeans and concert t-shirts. And there's a 14-year-old boy in there who's cooler than all of them. And the first person to arrive to the hospital that day is my best friend, Benji. And when the nurses realize that I'm not going to see my parents before I'm rolled into surgery, they roll me to the other side of the emergency room. And they prop open these double doors and they let my friends stand in the doorway. And the boys say incredibly inappropriate things to make me laugh. And the girls tell me they love me. And I can hear them chanting my name as I'm rolled into surgery that day. None of the gifts that I buy my friends that day ever make it into their hands. Everything is lost in the accident. And the only casualty of the day is the betta fish. It does not survive the accident. But it turns out that Pat was wrong on that sidewalk when he told me that friends don't get friends surprise Christmas presents. Because my friends gave me the best gift of my life that day. They gave me the gift of family. And until I meet my wife 15 years later, they're the only family I have and the only family that I need. Thank you.
Nice. Beautiful story. Does it still pull your heartstrings a little bit?
Every damn time. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
but it's a
I've probably told that story 200 times. I use it in workshops all the time because it works well for a lot of reasons. And it's the most important moment of my life, or one of the most important moments of my life. And I can't even say sentences in that story without feeling it. So,
well, let's talk about why it's the most
crazy.
important part, because like I said in the preamble, it's not because you were dead, which is wild. It's
Right.
because the curtains pulled back and you realize that you are in fact loved and there are in fact people who care about you. And that means more than anything else. And that's the 5-second
Right.
moment.
Yeah, it's the idea that no one can connect with the idea of going through a
Hmm.
windshield or dying in the back of an ambulance. So trying to make the story about that is just ridiculous. It's funny because when I tell that story to an audience, whether it's a workshop of people or an audience in a theater, people become emotional all the time, more emotional than me quite often, but they never are emotional when
Sure.
I die in the story. I always tell people in the workshop, I say, I watched you cry when my friend showed up, but when I died in the story, they
Mhm.
just blink at me. They just they just take in the information that I went through a windshield and my legs were ripped open. And if they're very empathetic, they might wince, or if they have a good imagination, they might wince a little bit, but not wincing on my behalf, just wincing at the thought of that
Right.
gore, that
Right.
that horror of what happened to me,
Mm.
because nobody can connect with that. It's not a thing that people can connect to. It's one of the reasons I always hesitate to tell that story in workshops, even though it works really well for lots of reasons. My fear is that people think something like
Hmm.
that has to happen to you in order to tell a good story, where 95% of the stories that I tell are tiny little moments in our lives that most people would not even notice as significant, because most stories
Mm.
actually just take place in our heads. The moments where we actually something fundamentally important shifts in us, it often happens in our minds. And if you're watching it happen, if you're an outsider watching this moment happen, you wouldn't even know that something important is happening. That's
Mm.
most of the stories I tell. So you don't need to go get in a car accident or get arrested or be homeless
Mm.
in order to tell a good story. In fact, those are
Mm.
the hardest
Well,
stories to tell.
let's expand on that for a little bit then, because obviously the whole, well, not obviously, but as you state, for anyone who's listening who hasn't read the book, it's not obvious, but the whole story pivots and relies on that 5 second moment. So if you had stopped the story at the point where you're calling McDonald's, it's like a funny little ending. And it's still a memorable story because it's very well crafted and it still is impactful and all these reasons, but it's not an amazing story until at the end you get the whole emotional sort of character development, if you want to, critique it. But
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
5 second moments is everything. That's a big takeaway. How does one go about cultivating 5 second moments? Because this is something I intentionally tried to do when I finished your book. I did the homework for life. Admittedly, I didn't continue it, but I did do it for a while. And I found a few, but I tell you, I didn't find as many as you sort of said that I would. So, how can we think about this a little bit?
Sure. So when we talk about these moments, I make the argument that every story is about a 5 second moment. Really, it's a
Hmm.
1 second moment. I'll stretch it to five for most people. But what it is the idea that the changes that we're looking to describe in stories, because that's what a story is. It's about change over time. It's either a moment of realization, I've changed my mind about something, or transformation. I've suddenly become a different person. The story that I just told you is realization. I realized I had a family. I realized I am loved, right? Those moments are instantaneous. There's stuff that leads up to the moment of change, but the change itself is like the flipping of a coin. It happens instantaneously. I don't feel loved, and now I feel loved. I used to think this, and now I think that. I used to think this of myself, now I think that of myself. Movies and books are the same way. All of these changes happen in an instant. Lots and lots of stuff leads up to the moment, but this is the moment where something happens. So those are those 5 second moments. Those are the moments we're looking to describe. In life, what we're trying to do as we move through our lives is we're just looking for the moments when we suddenly feel or think a little
Hmm.
differently than we did before. And I use the word a little because I
Sure.
really believe a little is enough. Like just a small change of mind, a small change of heart is enough to tell a story. And what we need to do as human beings, not even as storytellers, I think fundamentally as a human, it is a better life when you spend the time thinking about your
Hmm.
life and looking for these moments in order to find truth in your life that you're not seeing right now. I think that the best storytellers in the world are slightly self-centered. Actually, are very self-centered. Not in that negative way, but in that way
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we are deeply curious about ourselves. We
They
find
want to know why
the
they are the way
time to
they
think
are.
about ourselves. And in this world, right, yeah, why you are the way you are.
Hmm.
It's a question I ask myself all the time. Why do you do the things that you do? Most people in the world spend an enormous amount of time thinking about their children, their parents, their families,
Hmm.
their neighbors, their colleagues, their job. They don't often say to themselves, well, I'm just going to spend some time thinking about myself right now. That's what I actually do. And what I believe is a very healthy thing. I think we have to afford ourselves the opportunity to think about ourselves. Homework for Life is one of those ways where you force yourself to reflect back upon your day. And over the course of time, I believe everyone will develop a lens for storytelling. I believe eventually everyone will be able to
Yeah.
start to see stories in their lives that you
Because
can't
otherwise
see
you
right
just
now.
forget about the times, don't you? Because anyone can look back at who they were 5 years ago and think, yeah, I guess I thought about things differently then, which implies there's been changes, but you don't remember where the change happened unless it's like so extreme, like the story you just told. It's usually much subtler. It's like I had and forgive me if I'm strawmanning it, but I had a interaction with my barista who really just reminded me that the little things actually matter, right? And that could be a 5-second moment if it's blanketed in a proper story. And that's such a tiny interaction, but it's not so trivial. It's actually the case that those tiny interactions can work to change you. It doesn't have to be with your wife, your father, your best friend. It can be with a random person that you interact with. And like um I think what you say is very it resonates again with me a lot. The idea of trying to understand why you are the way you are. It's not an easy thing to do, really,
Yeah.
because only you can sort of really know, and I'm not sure.
Well, it takes time too. Just earlier in the summer, I have a son named Charlie. He's 9. We went to play golf. So I sat him down on this bench and I said, I'm going to go pay the guy. So I go pay the guy. And when I come back to Charlie, he's pointing at a little plaque on
Mm.
the bench. And the plaque says, like, in memory of John. And Charlie says, what's this? And I said, oh, John probably passed away. He liked to play golf here. His friends had this bench installed and put the plaque on so that they would always remember him. And Charlie says to me, when you die, I'm going to have a fountain built for you. And then when mommy dies, I'm going to have a fountain built right next to your fountain because you're married. And then when you're both dead, you can grant wishes from heaven
Jeez,
when
it
people
melts your
throw
heart.
pennies in the fountain. And
Yeah.
so all of these things happen to me when he says that. First of all, I'm thinking, why do you constantly contemplate my death? You're always talking about when I'm dead.
Yeah.
Stop doing that. I'm dealing with existential crises here. Don't do that. And then my second thought was, who says I'm dying first? Why do you always kill me off before you kill mom off? That's also deeply upsetting. And then third, why do I have to have a job when I'm dead? Like, aren't I doing enough here already when I'm dead? Now I have to find a way to grant wishes for people with pennies and fountains. All of that happens. But then the biggest thought
Mm.
I have is, I'm not going to get that fountain. It occurs to me instantaneously that as children, we make promises that as adults, we don't often keep, even when
Mm.
those promises are completely doable and we still care about them. So I was thinking, like, when I was a kid, I swore I would always have ice cream for breakfast. I still want ice cream for breakfast. I can have ice cream for breakfast, and yet I don't do it. When I was a kid, I used to go to my grandparents' house and they'd serve fruit cocktail from a can in that sugary syrup that I love so much on Christmas morning. And I asked my mother, can we have it in our house? And she said no. And when I was a kid, I promised myself I'm going to have fruit cocktail in a can when I'm an adult. I can do that, and I didn't do it. And my favorite car in the world is a Toyota 4x4. It's totally within my means to have a Toyota 4x4 in my life. Still love the car, and yet I drive a Hyundai Tucson. So looking at Charlie that day, I thought, ugh, I'm not going to get a
Mm.
fountain because you're going to be just like me and not keep the promises of childhood. Now that happened in June. And I knew it was a moment. And it didn't feel to me like it was enough of a story. But I just said to myself, being deeply curious about myself, I'm going to think about that. I'm going to keep it in my head. I'm going to keep it rolling around. What can I do with that? Why is that feel so important to me for some reason? Like, it's an amusing moment. I knew it could entertain people, but it just felt more important to me. It was 3 days ago. 3 days ago, it suddenly hit me. I was playing golf with my son. When I was a kid, no adult ever came to a sporting event with me, never was in attendance when I was competing in something, and never helped me learn a sport. I had to do everything on my own. And when I was a kid, I promised myself that when I'm a parent, I'm not going to do this to my kid. And suddenly I realized that even though I didn't do the ice cream or the fruit cocktail or the Toyota 4x4, I'm playing golf with my son. Like I'm keeping the most important promise I ever made to
Mm.
myself as a kid. I'm doing the thing for my son that was not done for me. I don't think that, though. I
Hmm.
don't realize that until 3 months after the bench, right? So if you're not a storyteller, what happens is
Sure.
you don't actually get to that final realization because you're not curious enough. But can you see how that moment for me, like there were tears in my eyes
Hmm.
when I realized, oh my God, I played golf with Charlie. That is the most important promise. Tears in my eyes. I suddenly feel better about myself.
Hmm.
Like suddenly the fruit cocktail and the Toyota 4x4 mean nothing to me because I'm just doing the most important thing. Those are the moments that happen to me all the
Yeah.
time because I see things and I don't let go of them. I hold on to them. I let them roll around a while and then I find the thing that I'm trying to say or the thing that I tend to think the back of our mind, that unconscious part of our brain is trying to tell us all the time. I think there's a part of our brain that's always screaming at us to pay attention to things. And if we don't take a moment, if we don't take 3 months to
Yeah.
continue to think about a bench and a boy, we just lose them. So I think we have to be deeply curious about our lives.
That anecdote you just explained, really, it emphasizes that that's irrespective of whether you're ever going to tell someone that
Correct.
story. That's actually just a quality of life thing. That's a finding pleasure, even more pleasure than you already had playing golf with your son. It's like, you know, everything that your son means to you, you can now realize it even more so in that exact moment, and that's, I mean, that's invaluable, right?
Right.
So, talk to me about the importance of writing these things down, because I imagine, because you are, I would presume, a practitioner of homework for life. Um, when Charlie, right, your son Charlie,
Yep, Charlie.
when Charlie a couple of months ago said he's going to build a fountain for you when you're dead, you went home, I guess, and said, this was a very memorable moment today,
Right.
and because it was written down, can you emphasize how important it is separating it from the swirl and putting it somewhere external to sit?
Yeah, well, it has a couple benefits, I think. The first is I just think that when you write things down, and I'm writing these things down mostly in a spreadsheet in a series of 5 to 6
Hmm.
sentences, it codifies it. It allows your visual memory to, mine is not very strong, but it allows you to see it. It sort of makes it a thing. I always
Hmm.
tell storytellers that all the stories you think about in your head are meaningless unless you're speaking them out loud. All the stuff that swirls around in your brain means nothing unless you bring it to some reality, whether it's on a page, which creates something, or you're speaking it out loud, which serves the same purpose. So I
Hmm.
think that it makes it a more indelible moment in your life. You're much more likely to remember it. But then even if you're not able to remember it, you now have a record of it. And that can be really useful. Back in May of this year, one of my homework for life entries, very boring seemingly, was it was the first night where we had a patio dinner with our neighbors. We've got neighbors here. I can see their house from where I'm sitting, and neighbors to our right.
Hmm.
And both of those neighbors have little kids about our children's age. So all three backyards are one backyard, and all of our children play together all the time.
Oh, cool.
And so
That's
back in May, we had all the neighbors on the patio for the first outdoor dinner of the season. And that's all I wrote was just a boring, like the moon was orange and everybody was happy.
Hmm.
So 2 weeks ago, I discovered that the neighbors that in the house I'm looking at right now, they're getting a divorce. Like their marriage is over and it's been failing for 2 years. That
Hmm.
same week, I discovered the neighbors to the right, they're also getting a divorce.
Mm.
And suddenly, a moment in my homework for life, which would be totally forgettable and seemingly unimportant, in May, everyone was on the patio
That now
looking
sets the
happy.
scene. Yeah.
Now it's a story because I realized they were all pretending. The only
Hmm.
couple on that patio that was actually happy was me and Alicia. We were
Hmm.
sitting in the company of people whose relationships were crumbling and we had no idea. And
Mm.
in my mind, I don't know if this is going to be a story, but it was just that realization that you never know what's happening behind the front door in someone's house. You never know what's going on in someone's marriage. And to assume otherwise is crazy. So, what was a moment that seemed unimportant and utterly forgettable suddenly becomes the first note in a story about us really deeply being worried that these families are going to move away from us, and this one backyard from three backyards is going to evaporate when
Mhm.
strangers move in instead of the
And they
people
put
we
a wall
love.
up.
Yeah. So
Mm.
you just never know what is going to be valuable and what is not, and what moments are going to have meaning. So we just grab them all. We grab all the moments that feel like there's something. We put them down and we hope that someday something comes from them.
Mm. I think what I'm going to do is create that or re-access my Google spreadsheet and actually put it in the and make a blank copy and put it in the podcast description so people can really access it there because like I said, I stopped doing it because like any sort of habit, once you fall out of it, you fall out of it. But I think speaking to you now is definitely going to be enough to redo it because one of the amazing points you've made, and you've made this on other podcasts before, so forgive me for bringing up old news, but you feel you forget chunks of time, right? So the last
Yeah.
year I've lived in this city, Stockholm. I'm not a Swede. I moved here because of my girlfriend. We live in the suburbs. I don't necessarily have a community here. What I've been doing is like working to the bone, which is great. It's a great time for me to do it. I'm no complaints. But, you know, the last 12 months, there aren't many exciting moments to take from it. However, I do realize, and I was thinking about this in preparing to speak with you, even every day things are happening. You know, we got a little
Yeah.
kitten. There was this amazing moment with Emma's sister and her mother. You know, beautiful moment, which in itself is a memory, not just for me, but for them. And anyway, I just want to emphasize that I'm going to put that into the podcast description. And it is an amazing practice to just every day find some highlights, put them down, let them swell. And the subconscious is an amazing piece of machinery. It's going to come back, like you've said, with a few examples here. And hopefully bear some fruit. Even if you never tell us a story, it's just going to add to your quality of life, really,
Yeah.
which is
And
quite a
and I'll
promise.
add, don't and I'll add, I wouldn't say the word highlights any moment.
Mm,
So low lights work well
sure.
too.
Yeah.
So, what I always say is it's the most story worthy moment, and you can have more than one.
Hmm.
Most of my days now have more than
Hmm.
one. It can be as simple as someone said something to you and that meant something to you, but it can be as something as stupid as the other day I was driving down my street and I looked up at a blue sky, and the thought entered my mind that I'm so glad the sky is blue because it's really a lovely color.
Hmm.
We could have ended up with like a burnt orange
Yeah.
sky, but instead we got blue. And that's in my homework for life. It's never going to be a story I tell on stage, but
Yeah,
a
never say
new
never.
thought entered my mind,
Yeah.
and a new thought is worthy of homework for life. You know, this mean game, I'll play it with you right now. Take your age, whatever it
Hmm.
is, subtract 9,
Hmm.
right? Whatever number you've come to, imagine that year of your life.
Hmm.
Like, how much do you remember from that year of your life? Just 9 years ago,
Yeah.
right?
Not much.
Right? We throw away our memories like they're trash, like they're meaningless. And what ultimately happens is we're 80 and we say, where did the time
Right.
go? And for me, with homework for life, every day gets marked. And so many people tell me, myself included, that when you do homework for life, time slows
Mm.
down because every day suddenly has a little bit of meaning rather than throwing them all away. What happens is we go around the sun and we have 4 things to say about it.
You're gonna
And
have
that's just ridiculous.
a beautiful memoir to pass on to your kids one day because of that as well. You're gonna have such a good
Yeah.
memory of it. Something I think about that I think it's a great practice. Any sort of parent should write a memoir for their kids. Um, Most people definitely shouldn't publish it for the world, but at least for their kids. Doesn't have to be long, whatever. And I'm thinking with my own children to write, a letter every single year on their birthday, sort of just this is how you've changed this year, and this is you this year, whatever. And so it gets to the point
Yeah.
when they're, in their 30s, and it's like you've got a short story documenting this person's life, and it's just another form of writing down our experiences, another form of homework for life, I guess, which could have beautiful consequences.
Yeah, when my kids were young, actually, the moment I discovered Alicia was pregnant, which I knew before she knew, oddly, I started writing to my kids. And I did that for the first 8 years of their life. And it's on a
Mm,
blog. It's on a blog called Greetings, Little
mm,
One. Every single day for 8 years, I wrote to my
wow.
children. And then eventually someone offered to turn them into books. So I have these enormous books. There's 6 of them. And they're some of the favorite things my kids have because they can go back and look for the first
That's
time they
amazing.
walked. And I wrote about the first time I walked, and so that might be like a level of commitment that is too much for most parents. But I will tell you, those books will be in our family for hundreds of years. They are bound and beautiful, and they're a record of
That's amazing.
the first 8 years of a kid's life, which is great because we don't remember our first 8 years at all. So that was the purpose of it. I kind of regret stopping after 8 years, but it just became. I
Oh,
was
you
like,
didn't
all
have to
right,
do it every
enough.
day,
Like, I
did you?
just
But
can't.
that's really that's amazing parenting. I really think that's like such a great service to do your kids, because hopefully as well it almost does the reverse effect where they can understand you better. And at the time,
Yes.
obviously they won't, but when they're adults, I mean, I wish my parents did just a semblance of that. They did absolutely nothing, and they both have
Yes.
terrible memories. So they
Right.
don't know anything. I don't know anything
Hmm.
about my extended family, barely enough about them, and I know them to be interesting people, but not able to communicate why they are. And so, yeah, just as a service to your kids
Yeah,
as
you're
well,
right.
I think it's an amazing thing.
Yeah, there was a night when there was a time when I used to be married. I had a short marriage, got divorced, and then married the love of my life. And we hadn't
Mm,
told the kids that. And at the same time, Alicia had been engaged and came within 2 months of getting married to someone else before she called off the engagement and
hmm
ultimately married me. And we hadn't told the kids that. And so one night we decided this will be the night we tell the kids that I was once married before and you were once engaged before. And when we sat down at dinner to tell them, Clara, my daughter, goes, we already know that. We read that in Greetings, Little One. You wrote about that when we were like
Wow.
4. And I said, I did? And she said, yeah, you wrote all about it. We already know it. And I went, all right, never mind. I guess I'll just eat dinner. But like, it's good. Like, it made me feel good that there's probably tons of things in those books that I've
hmm
completely forgotten about, but now exist
Yeah.
permanently for my
No, really,
kids.
that's
Yeah.
a beautiful thing. Let's move it away back into bigger picture narrative, because we're talking here about this 5 second moment, what a story really is about, why it's memorable, and you have a very memorable chapter title. I wanted to say famous. I'm sure it's famous. Can you explain why Jurassic Park isn't actually about dinosaurs?
It's my favorite thing to talk about for all the
Yeah.
movies like it, but this one works really well. So, if you watch the movie Jurassic Park, you would think it's about dinosaurs, but it's not. All the great movies are actually about something much more important
hmm
than what they seem to be about. So Jurassic Park is actually a movie about a man who can't be with the woman he loves. He can't really be connected with her fully because she wants to have children and he does not. And you discover it in the beginning of the movie. They're at a dig site. They're both archaeologists, and they're looking at a dinosaur, the image of a dinosaur, and this kid says it looks like a giant chicken. And our hero, Alan Grant, he goes up to the kid and he's got this fossilized claw in his hand, and he says this giant chicken would essentially rip you open and begin eating you while you're
Mm.
alive. And he scares the crap out of this kid. And so then he walks away with his girlfriend Ellie, and she says, "Why'd you do that to that kid? Why'd you scare the hell out of that kid?" And he said, "You know how I feel about kids. They're smelly, they're stupid, they're expensive. I don't like them. You want one of those?" And she says, "Well, I don't want that one, but yes, I would like one." That's it. That's what the story is about. Ellie and Adam, Ellie and Alan can't be
hmm
together because she wants kids and he doesn't. And so what happens over the course of the movie? Alan Grant ends up in Jurassic Park with 2 children. Like, it's not a mistake that he's the one who ends up with the 2 kids. And as you watch the relationship, at first he's annoyed with the kids. They touch expensive things. He yells at them not to touch things. They do stupid things. He gets annoyed at their stupidity. He doesn't know how to do things. But as the movie progresses, he gets closer and closer to these children as he's trying to keep them alive. The end of the movie, I always say, takes place actually in a tree at night. They've climbed up a tree. They've just fed some plant eating dinosaurs in a sweet little moment. And then he takes both kids in his arms. And the boy, Tim, he makes a joke. And it's the biggest laugh Alan gives of the entire movie. And he pulls Tim in closely. And then the girl, Lexi, she says, "What if the bad dinosaurs come back tonight?" And he says, "I'll stay awake all night." And she says, "All night?" And he says, "Yes." And he pulls them in
Mm.
as close as you can be to 2 children. And as he pulls them in, that claw that he threatened the boy with at the beginning of the movie falls away. He's now let go of the thing that he used to think was most important, which was fossils and dinosaurs and this business. And now he's holding the thing that is the most important, which is children. And now he can be with his girlfriend and they can get married and be happy forever because he wants to have kids. That's what the movie's really about. Spielberg understands I can't make a movie about dinosaurs because everyone's made a movie about dinosaurs. And if I said, hey, Ryan, do you want to go to a movie where we watch a man who fundamentally
Yeah.
doesn't want to have children over the course of the movie, we'll discover a love for children? You'd say, no, thank you. But if I package that around dinosaurs, now you want to go see the movie. You might not even know that was what the movie was about. But what I would argue is when you leave the movie, you think, that was a good one. Like, I've
Yeah.
seen dinosaur movies before, but that was a really good one. And you'll trick yourself into believing it's CGI. It was like the kitchen scene with the velociraptors. My argument will be, no, somewhere in the back of your brain, like you understood in a fundamental level that you actually watched a human story taking place, change over time. I used to be a guy who didn't want to have kids, therefore could not be with his girlfriend. Some stuff happened, and now I can be with her forever because I love kids.
And
That's what
I
movie
think at the
making is
end you
about.
answered what I wanted to ask you, which was, when I think about Jurassic Park, or if you poll the random person on the street, they remember the Velociraptors and the T-Rex. They don't remember this character development. And I wanted to ask whether that was us, like, or yourself, just like over critically analyzing it and saying, hey, this is actually what it was about. Or if it was, in fact, it's just, this is your sort of subconscious emotional connection to the movie, but it was great because we remember the dinosaurs. And that makes it a little bit different to your story, where the
Yes.
emotional pull at the end is what's memorable, surrounded by the car accident, rather than what Jurassic Park is, which is the car accident is memorable, but the emotional pull like makes us love it.
Yes. My car
Yeah.
accident is akin to the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park, right? It's a thing that draws people in. It's the excitement. It's the uniqueness of the story in the same way the dinosaurs are the uniqueness of Jurassic Park. But ultimately, my story cannot be about a car accident because you can just turn on the news and see those all the time. You know, the other thing I always point about the car accident, by the way, is if we agree that stories are about these 5-second moments of realization or transformation, it turns out that when you die, I've done it twice now, you don't actually know you're dying. I did not have a moment of realization or transformation because I closed my eyes. At some point, I died, and then at some point, I came back to life, but I was not aware of any of it. You can't tell a story about
Sure.
something you're fundamentally unaware is happening to you. So, I can't even make the story about
Yeah.
that unless
Or unless
unless it
you
was going to be
manufacture
something that
some
was
like light
odd
at the end
and
of the tunnel
not very
moment that you
interesting.
had.
Right, which just sadly did not happen. You know, the other thing about that story I'll add is I didn't know the story was about my friend showing up in the emergency room at first. A director from the Moth called me and said, "Hey, why don't you tell your car accident story?" Because I had like gone through all my stories with her. And I said, "Yeah, but that's just a car accident story. Why would I want to tell that?" And she said to me, "What happened after the car accident?" And I said, "Oh, you know what happened? My friend showed up to the emergency room when my parents didn't." And as soon as I said that, I went, "Oh, that's what the story is, right?" That was a Moth producer being deeply curious about my life before I
Yeah.
understood I needed to be deeply curious about my life, right? So I didn't even have the story until someone asked me, "What was the thing that happened after you came back to life?" And then I
How much more
understood I
time
had
do
a
you have,
story.
Matthew? Oh, okay, lovely.
Oh, as much as you
Okay.
want. No one's awake in my house yet,
Well,
so I'm
I
fine.
because I did have a
I've yet
couple
to hear
more
anyone.
prepared questions that I'd like to ask you. Okay, so I laughed out
Yeah, go right
loud
ahead.
when you said the weather sucks story break, because it's so goddamn true, and you would have a hard time up here in Sweden, because it is just so fundamental and cornerstone to social interactions, but more so than just like a breaking the ice thing. Um, it, it's it's droned on and on and on and on and on. And I'm from Australia. The weather's always good there, so we don't talk about it. Here, the weather's never good, so that's all they talk about. How can one? How can one, without being sort of rude or just like dismissive, engineer more interesting, meaningful conversations into their lives?
Well, I do one of two things. I try to avoid the people who are boring. I
Sure.
just have people in my life who like to complain. That's the worst one for me. People who just complain, I just avoid them whenever I can. But the other thing you can do is you can change the subject. So if someone's droning on about the weather, the next thing I'll
Yeah.
say is, here's a funny thing that my daughter said to me the other day. I won't even acknowledge the conversation about the weather. I don't, I don't allow it to be something that comes out of my mouth.
Hmm.
And instead, I just try to shift the conversation if possible.
Mm.
And that can be slightly effective. You really can't say to people, you're talking about the weather again. That's not entertaining. It's
Hmm.
not engaging. It's purposeless. It's meaningless. Please stop. I can say that to certain people in my life, but like I can count the number. Yeah, it's rude. Yeah. So I just say try to shift the topic of conversation whenever you can. Allow them to say their piece, but don't acknowledge it as something that was important to you.
Yeah. This is a bit of a silly question because there's no right answer. But I was wondering for yourself, is there a greater story that has ever been told that you're intimately familiar with?
So a story, a great. What do you mean by a
Greatest
greater
story
story?
ever told.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, I heard Steve Zimmer, who's a great storyteller in New York, once tell a story about a snow fort that brought in sort of everything you would want in a story.
A real
Humor.
story?
Yeah, a true story. Yeah, a humor and excitement and pathos and meaning and all of it. When my wife and I both heard the story, he was competing against me in a Grand Slam championship. He told that story, and my wife turned to me and she said, "Well, you're done." And I and I thought, she's right. That
Yeah.
might be the best story I've ever heard told on a stage in my life. So there was that. I don't know if there's a recording that can be accessed from it, but I just remember hearing that story and thinking that's probably the best story I've ever heard told on stage. So yeah.
Is that
Uh,
available in your podcast?
no, it was told at the Moth, and I don't have those.
It wasn't
I can't use
recorded.
a Moth recording on my podcast.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never found it. I've referenced it before, and I've looked for it, and the Moth has never aired it yet. So I have no recording of it. I only have a beautiful memory of
Hmm.
it.
As someone who is intimately involved with storytelling, narrative, this sort of this idea of marketing a little bit. Are there big brands and media personalities who you recognize as being masters of storytelling?
Mike
Steven Spielberg.
Birbiglia, yeah, Mike Birbiglia, the comedian who's really a storyteller. I study tons of what he does. He is really a funny storyteller, not a comedian, I
What's his
would
name?
argue. Mike Birbiglia.
Okay.
He's an American. He actually started at the Moth. He actually started telling stories. He tells a very famous story about he has a sleep disorder that forces him to requires him not it makes him get out of bed. He enacts the things that he's dreaming.
Yeah.
And so he threw himself out of the second floor window of a hotel once,
Wow.
thinking that he was being chased by a jackal.
Yeah.
And now he has to sleep in a special sleeping bag where his wife zips him up to his neck so that he can't get out. He has to take drugs to paralyze himself at night. So he told that story, many, many years ago and sort of got a lot of attention for it and has since done a whole bunch of one-man
Hmm.
shows, so one-person shows for Netflix and things like that.
Oh, cool. Look
And
into it.
he's a genius. Yeah, he's fantastic. I've watched some of his specials multiple times because his ability to transition from a story to some amusing anecdote and then back into the story seamlessly is just
Yeah.
brilliant. So I think he's terrific.
Mm. Any others, or that stands alone as a great one?
Um, well, I mean, Steve Zimmer, who you can see some of his stories on the internet, the Moth Storyteller, I think he's the best storyteller I've ever competed against in my life. I also think that the comedian, but I would say storyteller Tig Notaro is pretty extraordinary. There is moments in her shows when she's just doing stand up, but a lot of times she is storytelling as
Hmm.
well. I think there's a bunch of comedians in the world today that are really storytellers who tell funny
Hmm.
stories. And then they will pepper their shows with actual jokes, but the stories themselves that exist within their shows are so great because what a comedian does is they find a story, they work on it for 9 months in front of 400 audiences until they find it perfect, until they craft it in a perfect way. Even I don't do
Yeah.
that. I work out a story. I figure what's going to go well, and then I go perform it. And then I might perform it a few more times, but then I'm on to my
Yeah.
next story, whereas a comedian will spend a year honing their craft
Yeah.
perfectly. So I like paying attention to those folks when they're good
The
storytellers.
comedian comparison is one that I immediately would make as well. Someone who is just literally crafting things for a comedic effect on the other end. But what about like the
Yeah.
emotional appeal? Like, are there any big brands who you think master storytelling? Nike's famous for it, though I don't know if it's fair that they are famous for it. Apple as well. Do you think about it from that perspective a bit?
Well, I guess the one big brand I would say that sort of gets it right every time is Pixar.
Mm,
You know, the films that they make. Again, I know that a Pixar film takes somewhere between 5 to 10 years
mm.
to make, and it's constantly focus grouped. So, those are fictional
Is it
stories.
actually? Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't know that.
It takes an endlessly long period of time for them to make a film. Their movie Frozen, for example, I think it took 6 years, and it's a
Hmm.
lot of we make a story, we see what people think, and then we change it based upon what they think. So just like the
Hmm.
comedian who goes out on the road for a year and hones that story till it's perfect, Pixar does the same thing in a fictional way. They really nail it just about every single time.
Hmm.
My great disappointment is I just think there's a lot of bad storytelling in the world, including movies. I think a lot of times people leave a movie and think the movie was excellent. And I look at it, my wife is famous for saying, like, we left the movie Wonder Woman. And as we were walking across the parking lot, she said to me, "Can you let me think that was good for about 10 minutes before you tell me why it was terrible?" And I said, "I never have to tell you why it was terrible. You can just go on throughout life thinking it was good." I said, "It's a terrible movie that sends an awful message. But if you want to continue to think that it's great, I have no problem with that." So, eventually I explained to her why, and she said, "You've now ruined the movie." But you are
Hmm.
correct. She acknowledged that my assessment of the movie was correct. But I think that's what happens. I think people like, I don't want people to go to a movie, read a book, or even listen to one of my stories and sort of analyze it to the degree that I do. I understand that's not a realistic expectation, but I do want people to question whether what they just saw was good, whether what they saw was the best version of it, whether it said the thing that it was trying to say. And I think that doesn't
Yeah, I
happen
mean, well,
very
that would
often.
be nice, wouldn't it? But
Yeah.
it's unfortunately, I think there's too much expectations at the moment. But though
Yeah.
it's good to set high expectations, isn't it? Um, but I had on a guest called Angus Fletcher. Maybe you're familiar with him, maybe not.
No.
He wrote a book called Storyworthy, and it's kind of like inventions of literature.
Hmm.
A really fascinating guy. Thinks a lot about narrative and stories. And he kind of like breaks down the idea of the hero's journey as this, almost like subconscious archetypal storyline that we just resonate with completely.
Yeah.
And what he says and what I agree with is it's kind of just survivorship bias. There was a really good story that they copied again and again and again with very small iterations. Pixar famously, Frozen famously. Um, Yet there are a lot of movies like, say, Wonder Woman, or I find it increasingly difficult to find a really good movie. I don't know. Maybe I mean, this is now stepping away from the content of Storyworthy, and it's more just a generalized chat. But I'm sure it's something you think about a lot as well. Like, do you have any big ideas for why movies are so much less satisfying? Sort of, it's so much harder to find a movie that you step away from thinking, man, that sort of hit me here a little bit. You don't really get that anymore.
Yeah. Well, they don't make, unfortunately, a lot of the movies that do that, I think, for us because, you know, we don't go to the movies to see small stories and, these meaningful moments that can touch us. We go to the movies now because they better be, you know, big action moments or, hilarious set pieces that are going to
Mhm.
be memorable forever. And I understand that. I watched all of the Marvel movies during the pandemic with my family. I had never
Mhm.
seen any of them before. And so we
Oh, okay.
started at the first one and worked our way all the way through. My wife says it was one of the best things we ever did during the pandemic. We sat next to my son and we just watched the Marvel universe, which was great.
I mean,
You
that
know,
is
I
cool. That is cool. Yeah.
it yeah, it was a blast, and some of those movies are not bad at all. Like, I
Hmm.
enjoyed it. I enjoyed all of them. Some of them are actually fairly interesting to me.
Hmm.
But, if every movie has to be something like that, it's going to be really challenging. And so
Hmm.
then when I tell people, like, I remember I saw a movie years ago called Lars and the Real Girl. And it's fantastic. And there's just no way that movie can like be successful and compete against the world today. It's just about a guy who buys I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's a really great movie. It's about a guy who buys a sex doll, and the neighbors sort of are aware that this man who lives alone has just bought a sex doll. And he loves it. Like he just loves this girl, this sex doll. It's a great movie, but there's just no room for it in the world today, and especially in terms of our headspace, because there's so much content being produced right now. Even when something comes out, it's often so hard to talk to people about it and to really think about it because no one's watched the same thing. We've all watched so many different things now because there's not like 4 movies at the movie theater. There isn't 4 television shows every night. Like it's just so much content, which is beautiful and fantastic.
Mhm.
But if I want to talk about how great the show Fleabag is, I have to find someone who has seen that British comedy that appeared on Netflix, and it's just hard to even find someone who's watched it.
Right.
So I think that becomes all very challenging. And so what happens is movies have to be huge in order to gain cultural awareness,
Yeah.
and then we lose some of the great stories that we could have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it like liquidates to the middle for relatability rather than that
Yeah.
small. Yeah. Look, Matthew, you have been so generous with your time, and so I don't want to take advantage of your generosity because I could just sit here and chit chat with you, but I'm also mindful of the generous listener who's still with us 2 hours in. So I was hoping to finish out with 2 baseline questions that I ask every single guest, and then if you would indulge me, I could tell you a story that I wrote immediately after I finished your book, trying to apply some things, and you could tell me where it needs to be improved.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
cool. First off, question. This is actually kind of a geopolitics podcast, just FYI.
Okay.
But what is there a country that you're very bullish on? Which is just to say, a country you think is heading in the right direction, has an amazing future ahead of it.
Wow. As an American, I often look to the north and think that Canada is sort of it just feels like the place that not everything is a thing. It just feels like a place filled with decent human
Mm-hmm.
beings. And maybe that's my perception because I'm in America, which is a country I love, and I'm very bullish on my own
Mm-hmm.
country to a certain degree. We went through 4 years where I was not so bullish, and now I'm slightly more bullish. But I often think that Canada represents sort of the better side of humanity, and so I often think that it's not going to take over the world, Canada, which is kind of a lovely
Yeah.
thing. That there's a country that exists that is solid and good and is not threatening anyone and seems to be filled with a lot of good, decent people. So I think that's probably the country I often think about in terms of being bullish on.
Nice. Yeah, Canada gets a good. They get represented quite well here. A couple things going for them. Obviously, have enormous natural wealth, and they actually are only going to continue to get more natural wealth as more of the northern coastline becomes not habitable, but at least mineable. And then, obviously, if it
Yeah.
melts enough, they're also going to have some of the best shipping routes in the world with one of the biggest borders. So there's a lot of good things going for Canada. Obviously, an amazing culture and a very sort of not like old age liberal, but new age liberal ideas of equality and fairness and humbleness. There's like a real sort of humility to the Canadian culture, I think, as well, which is great. And they have some amazing cities, and they've got good tech, and they've got smart people, good universities. So I agree wholeheartedly. More interesting question. Who, if you could witness a conversation between any 2 people of history, dead or alive, who would they be and why?
Does it have to be a conversation that has happened, or do I put 2 people
2 people
together?
together. They could be living separate ages.
Wow. They could be living in separate ages. Well, I always want to talk to Winston Churchill, so he's going to definitely be on one side of the
Mm-hmm.
table. Whoever I want to put him with, it's going to be Churchill for sure. I think that guy is solid and interesting. I guess, the other guy I'm really sort of fascinated with. I'd love to hear Churchill and Lincoln have a conversation. You know, I don't know, part of me just wants to bring Lincoln back to let him know it all worked out. It makes me crazy that someone does something, you know, he brings our country through the Civil War and sort of doesn't get to see whether it ends up
Right.
okay, although maybe today it's looking less okay than it used to. But I think it would be pretty fascinating because I think Churchill and Lincoln both brought their countries through really challenging and extraordinary times. And I would love to hear sort of like their
Sure.
philosophy and their more than their philosophy, actually, as the storyteller. I just want to know how
Hmm.
it felt. Like, I want to know how it felt. Churchill, I think, is fascinating just because he sort of is beloved and then
Hmm.
not beloved. And that makes me nuts. I just think, like, come on, Brits. Like, he was, he saved you, and then you just sort of tossed him aside a little bit. So I would just like to know on a personal level how hard it was and how they got
Hmm.
through their days, as human beings. I'd love to hear the two of them talk
No, that
about
would be
that.
fascinating. I mean, any table where Churchill is on the other side of would be entertaining at the very least. At the very least, yeah.
Yeah,
Like it would be, yeah,
that's
it'd
a
be
great
cool to
question.
see.
I'm gonna be thinking about it all day. I'm gonna be thinking literally all day. I'm gonna be going, was there a better choice
Nice.
than those
Well,
two guys?
I mean, as you said off air, you're currently writing a new book. So, if you would be interested, I'd love for you to come back on and talk about it then as well. And maybe you can
I'd love to.
stew on it for a while and come up with the best answer ever at the end. Um,
Yeah. All
okay,
right.
so I guess this is putting myself out there a little bit, but it's okay. It's about my experience at my uncle's funeral. And this is the story. And I'm reading it off because I don't have it memorized. Okay.
Yep.
I don't care how messed up my uncle was. I'm at his funeral and it's as if no one cares. I'm walking down the center aisle of your typically stale and lifeless modern church. My grandfather and I are in lockstep making our way to the pew. It is his son who lays in the casket. The mood was awkward, mild, and the room was full of natural light. It was a Queensland summer, extremely hot and very sticky. As we made our way to our assigned seats, my grandfather purposely darted and pulled me over to the left side of the church, away from the rest of his family, away from his wife and his only living child. He decisively wanted to sit away from anyone who might see him weak, so he directed us far away as he could. Our whole family was seated on the right side of the church, while together, him and I sat alone on the left. I expected someone to say something, someone to help me redirect my grandfather towards the comfort of his family. But just like the mood of the whole occasion, people just ignored it. It was as if they didn't care. What I quickly realized, though, was that it was not for a lack of care the mood was so mild, but it was for exactly the opposite. All of the 18 attendees at this funeral were completely swelled up with agony, but to be misguided by their pride to not allow themselves to weep. And so, because everyone was ready to burst out in tears, no one dared be touched. My grandfather wasn't the type to hold hands, so when he took my hand and squeezed it firmly, it felt entirely unnatural. It's quite hot, so our hands quickly sweated, but I didn't mind the discomfort. I was 21 years old, and my granddad was showing me for the first time in his life sensitivity. He was pleading with me that I help him keep it together, but I couldn't for the life of me understand why he felt like he needed to keep it together. You're at your son's funeral. It's okay to cry. My grandfather was born in the 1930s rural Australia. They were bred tough. So tough it seemed that I was coming to realize as we continually deepened into the procession, it became clearer and clearer to me that my grandfather intended to bury the sum of all emotions he could possibly endure at his own son's funeral. He did not permit himself to cry. In his welling eyes, I could see misplaced pride wrestling with grief. He insisted that we talk throughout the service, asking me how the drive there was, whether we found a park, anything that would distract him from addressing the moment. I'd never before seen him so unsettled. No, mate, I said firmly. Pay attention, Dad's speaking, as my father gave his brother's eulogy. We sung a hymn. He loved to sing so much, yet he held back tears through a shaky voice and gritted teeth. The experience shone an insight into Australia and the older generations. As I surveyed the room, I was disturbed to realize there was barely a tear shed for the entire service from anyone. And then as I came to realize this, not even from me. Maybe this is a consequence of the subject of the funeral, but I doubt it. I think what I was witnessing was the wicker end of a tougher generation. Even my father, up there in front of 18 people, speaking of the life of his dead brother, even he wouldn't dare himself expose a crack in the armor. There was a sad, overwhelming sense in the air of simply, let's just get through it. Let's get through the formalities so we can put this behind us. I hated this mood. Why are you all too tough to cry? It's your family, for God's sake. But then I realized again, I had barely come close to a tear myself. What is happening? People wouldn't allow themselves to settle in the moment out of fear of embarrassment onto others their shedded weight of grief. The service was coming to an end, and I couldn't help but feel as if the funeral felt incomplete. I sensed that the moment had not been properly unwrapped. We hadn't yet properly acknowledged why we were all there. I expected everyone to avoid their tears. I expected no one to be able to talk about this on the ride home. I expected my parents to insist that we not bring up the funeral in the future. I was ashamed of myself and everyone in attendance for not having the courage to show that they cared. But what made the service beautiful, what made the service memorable, what justified the impact that my uncle had onto others was what happened to the room as we began filing out of the church. The wrapping seemingly shed. As the left and right columns filed into the center aisle to make their way out of the car, to the car, my grandfather met my grandmother in the middle, having just separately celebrated the life of their youngest son. She, at the sight of my grandfather, frail and vulnerable, finally let her guard down. She collapsed into her husband's arms and allowed herself to cry. She said through her tears, "It was a lovely service, wasn't it?" In response to which, my grandfather, the man who squeezed my hand for misdirection and wanted above all to be distracted from his own son's funeral, who under no circumstance would let anyone see him cry, finally buckled at the knees and let loose his carried grief. Tears streamed down his face as he embraced my grandmother. They held each other for the first time in years, sharing the grief for their lost son. The moment then cascaded permission for my father to cry, the sight of which then drew tears from others, and then, to my surprise, even me. But for some reason, true to my lineage, I didn't want anybody to see me cry. So rather than embracing my family, I swiftly exited the church, hid around the corner, and sobbed cathartically. Nothing softens the eyes quite like seeing your parents cry, but a beautiful justice was done for my uncle. Because in one moment, the moment when my grandparents embraced, the whole audience was given permission to let their emotions spill over. The mood of the church lifted, and the people were relieved of their grief, having done service to a man who left so powerful an impression on the few that he touched.
Well done. How did that feel?
I mean, there was definitely an emotional part towards the end of reading it. I hadn't read that for. I wrote this maybe 6 months ago or something after I finished your book. But yeah, so to write that, I made sure that I set the scene, I created stakes, I eliminated the fat, and I delivered the 5-second moment. In creating the stakes, I used the elephant, the backpack, breadcrumbs, the hourglass, and the crystal ball.
Yeah, you used them all, huh? I always have to remind people that in my book, I teach those stakes tricks, but I don't use them all in every story. I chose that story for the book because I need them all, because that story in the book is not appealing until the very end, really. You have to trick people into thinking it's good. So good job.
Yeah.
I thought it was
I asked
great.
for critique.
I'll offer you a few suggestions, but the number one thing I would think about is the idea that when we're telling a story, what we want to do is reproduce the same or something similar to the reaction that we had in our audience. So there are moments in your story when you sort of offer what I think of as a thesis statement before the moment takes place, and it's often problematic because it doesn't allow the audience to experience things in the moment you experience them. So, for example, like for example, at the very end when you said, "But what made the
Hmm.
funeral beautiful was," and then you described what happened after. In your experience, you were not leaving the church going, "But you know what's going to make the funeral
Hmm.
beautiful is what I'm about to see." But that's essentially what you told the audience. It's much more interesting for the audience to leave the church and see the things happen as a surprise rather than getting that sentence that prepares them for the surprise. Does that make sense?
For sure. So instead of saying, "But what made the moment beautiful," would it just be a like a not a cliche, but it would be like, "And as we were leaving, this happened."
Yeah.
Almost. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You want to have it reported. You want to report it to the audience in the same way that it happened to you. So other things like when you said your grandfather didn't want to be seen while weeping,
Mm.
it seemed like he had either said that to you or you surmised it.
Mm. I
And
surmised it.
so I want you to, rather than saying you said it as if like it was a truth in your grandfather, rather than I'm sitting there and suddenly I understand why we're on this side of the church.
Hmm.
He doesn't want to see people. He doesn't want people to see him weeping.
Sure.
So rather than just presenting it as institutional knowledge, I want to see it happen. When you hold your hand, right? You say he's not the type to hold hands,
Hmm.
right? Um, there's another idea also with the 1930s Royal Australia. He's the idea that those guys are tough.
Hmm.
What you want to do is we want to see him hold your hand, and then we want to feel the surprise that he's holding your hand.
Hmm.
So what you can do is if you set earlier in the story the idea that this is a tough guy from the 1930s Australia, he's the kind of guy who doesn't cry, he doesn't hold hands, he doesn't do this, he does that,
Hmm.
and you separate that explanation from the moment of him holding your hand. So rather than telling us he's holding your hand sort of after the fact, what we would want to see is we'd want to know he's a tough guy who doesn't hold people's hands. And then sitting in the church, suddenly you feel his hand close over yours.
Hmm.
And then we can feel that like, oh, we know him, and then we know why holding the hand is such a big
Big deal.
deal, rather than you telling us holding hands
Yeah.
is a big deal. Does that make
Yeah, for
sense?
sure. It's similar to
It's
the
the
first critique, right? Rather than like
It is, yeah.
report it as you feel it happening, rather than give context for people. Yeah.
Right. We almost want a second by second account of the story in many ways. Not literally because it would take
Sure.
forever, but all of those significant moments, we want to experience them as you experience them, and you want to preload us with the information that we require to make that moment have meaning. But the information and the moment have to be separate so that we can feel like we knew the guy for a little while, we knew the grandfather, and then he held
Hmm.
the hand, and now we have a reaction as a result. So it's just the idea that we want our audience to experience these things in the way we experience them. The tricky thing is the way you wrote the story in many ways is you were writing it from the you of now, or the you of the moment you were writing it. What you really want to be doing is writing the story from the perspective of the you in the
Mm.
church. So you have to eliminate everything you know
Yeah.
after the fact. Eliminate all of the understanding you have and only be in that
Like
moment.
tell the story live.
Yes, exactly. So eliminate all of the things that you learned later, all the things you surmised. Yeah, if you figured out something, you have to figure it out in front of us rather than telling us you
Mm.
figured it out. Um, that's mostly what I would say. The other little suggestion I'd give you is I think it might be an interesting beginning of the story if you used a little cognitive dissonance. If we started with I'm walking down an aisle in a church, right? Now we're like, oh, to create some
Right.
wonder initially. Are we in a wedding? Is this a wedding? I'm holding someone by the arm. Now we're thinking, is it a
Hmm.
woman? Is he getting married? It's my grandfather, right? And then we go, why is he walking down the aisle in church with his
Yeah.
grandfather, right? Up ahead is a coffin. And now it's weird because we expect your grandfather to be in
Right.
the coffin, right?
Yeah. Very
Not
true.
not on your arm. So all like you can lead us through the story a little bit slower in the beginning and really create an enormous amount of wonder. Even when you go off, like his wife is sitting on one side, but we turn right
Hmm.
and head to the other side. Don't tell us
Hmm.
why yet, right? Like just let us keep wondering like what is going. It's one of these stories that I get the sense right away that you could hold us in a state of wonder for a very long time until you finally settle in and you start to put together the pieces that day, like, oh, this is why he's over here,
Nice.
this is why he's doing that. So cognitive dissonance doesn't always work in the beginning of a story, but in this story, I just think because of all the
It's an unusual
circumstances and the way it
situation.
plays
Yeah.
out, you can, yeah, you can probably, you can't carry it too far because then people get frustrated with you if they can't, if they're wondering too much too
Mhm.
long, then they get frustrated. But I think you can get them all the way over to the other side of the church, sit down with grandpa, and then explain what you
Yeah.
figured out
I
is
mean,
going on. Then
I'm
I think
definitely
that'd be very
always,
engaging.
well, was conscious of, cutting the fat. And even as I read that, I felt like this maybe was a bit too long. But I also want to
Mm-hmm.
say,
Well,
like, I didn't say anything there about my uncle himself, and there's like a lot of context
yeah,
there for, why
right.
is this young man dead? But then that was cut away with a fat. But I don't know. Do you think it's worth a little bit of talking about him there, or it's not? It's kind of inconsequential because the story is about my granddad.
I think that I think it's a story about your granddad, and I actually think that by not explaining why your uncle is dead, that actually holds
Okay.
the audience much longer. And it's one of those
Yep.
things I
Yep.
think I would never say. It's I I think I write in the book that stories are like, I like to think of them as a coat. You put a coat on somebody, and the harder it is to take that coat off, the longer the
Hmm.
story lasts in someone's heart. If I don't know why your uncle died, I just think that story has more lasting appeal in my mind. It's not relevant to the story. Why your uncle died is not relevant. This is a story about a man who is unable to cry at his son's funeral and finally
Hmm.
finds the ability to do it, and makes
Yep.
you
Yep.
realize something about yourself in the process. So the cause of your uncle's death is
Mm.
not relevant really to the
Well,
story.
thanks for that, mate.
Yeah.
There's some free
Yeah.
masterclass at the end there. Cheers. um,
Anytime.
well,
I'm
look,
happy to do it.
Matthew Dix, really, an hour and a half has flown by. Really, really generous with your time. And also, thank you for the book. Storyworthy as well. Nothing beats the original text. So, we heard Matthew's story about the car accident. The book is littered with great stories similar to that. So there's the book. Obviously, you want to purchase it. I'm going to put the Google Drive for the homework into the podcast description. And also, you have a podcast. And what other stuff do you want to let people know about?
Well, I publish novels, so if you're interested in reading one of my novels, I think I have 6 novels, a book of nonfiction. Yeah, we have a podcast called Speak Up Storytelling. So if you want to hear stories that are produced here in New England, where we produce our shows, we take a story from one of our shows and then we
Mhm.
play it, so you get to hear a good story, and then we deconstruct it. We talk about what's going well in that story, what can be
Yep.
improved, sort of what I just did with you to a greater extent. And it's like a class on storytelling every week, and you get to hear my wife, who's wonderful, and she's the reason you need to
Amazing.
listen.
Well, thank you again, sir, and have a lovely day.
All right. Thanks so much.